15 seconds. That's all the time it takes to turn a dazzling wedding into a tear-soaked nightmare and push a fragile life right to the brink of death. Welcome back to the channel. Today's episode is going to be an absolute roller coaster of emotions. We'll go from James's ultimate protection and Chairman Hoan's nod of approval, straight to the sheer brutality of public gossip. But before we step into the eye of the storm, I have a real-life question for you guys. If you had the chance to marry a super rich man who loved you deeply, but the price was having to live every single day under the suffocating judgmental scrutiny of the elite, would you close your eyes and step into high society? Or would you turn around and choose a simple, peaceful life? Drop your thoughts down in the comments to see whether Team High Society or Team Peaceful Life is the bigger crowd. And now, take a deep breath. Let's get today's episode started. The waiting room was so quiet that Diep could clearly hear her own heart pounding in her chest. The faint scent of cedarwood couldn't soothe the freezing air caressing her skin. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The custom silk wedding dress featured an empire waist, cascading down like a flawless pearlescent waterfall. The soft silk embraced her body, light and airy with every breath. Her jet black hair was styled in an elegant updo, adorned with a few natural pearls that radiated a soft glow. The absolute minimalism exuded an invaluable beauty. Yet, a sense of suffocation still lingered, creeping through the air like a toxic mist. It didn't come from the dress, but from the brutal contrast right inside these four walls. Sitting on the sofa in a tucked-away corner of the room were Diep's mother and younger sister. Her mother wore a dark plum artificial silk ao dye. It was the most decent outfit she owned, but under the room's dazzling crystal lights, the fabric still caught the glare of crumpled wrinkles, laying bare an undeniable life of hardship. Diep's sister wore a simple flared dress, her hands constantly twisting the hem until the fabric was completely wrinkled. Her eyes darted around in panic and fear, taking in the oak-paneled walls and the extravagant avalanche roses overflowing on the stone pedestals. They were completely out of place. Diep lifted her skirt and took slow steps toward the sofa. The silk rubbed together, creating a rustling sound, haunting and lonely against the thick wool carpet. Seeing her daughter approach, the old mother quickly braced her hands against the seat to stand up. Her thin, sun-baked hands, marked with age spots and cracked from weathering the elements, reached out hesitantly. She wanted to touch her daughter, to smooth out the folds of her dress like any mother would before the wedding hour. But just as those rough fingers were about to brush against the delicate, shimmering silk, she froze. The deep-seated fear of an impoverished mother made her quickly pull her hands back, hiding them behind her back. She was scared that the rough scratches on her hands would snag the expensive fabric, scared that her poverty would stain her daughter's splendor. "Mom," Diep choked out. Her throat tightened, burning as if someone had rubbed salt in it. She stepped forward, reached out, and pulled the calloused hands hiding behind her mother's back. Her gentle hands enveloped those dry, bony joints, then decisively pressed them against her own perfectly made-up cheek. Ignoring the expensive foundation that might smudge, the rough warmth from her mother's palms seeped through her skin, bringing with it the smell of kitchen smoke, the scent of sweat-soaked hardships. That familiar smell instantly soothed the coldness of this space. "You're so beautiful, Diep," her mother said, her voice trembling. The corners of her eyes were red, her wrinkles bunching together as tears threatened to blur her cloudy vision. "But these people are too high class, and our family. I'm afraid that when we go out there, I'll embarrass you in front of the guests. Let me just stand in some hidden corner, okay? That raw, gut-wrenching sentence, carrying the deep-rooted insecurity of an aging mother, pierced Diep's heart like a sharp needle. Guilt and sorrow welled up, choking her. The class divide had never taken on such a tangible form. It showed in the way her sister didn't dare step firmly on the wool carpet, and the way her mother stripped herself of the right to touch her own daughter's wedding dress. Click. The brass doorknob turned. The heavy, pressurized silence broke. James walked in. He wore a charcoal gray suit, his tall, broad frame blocking the light from the hallway. He stood there like a solid fortress wall. His presence instantly banished the cold, isolating air of the waiting room. Seeing James enter in his formal attire, Diep's mother grew even more flustered. She hastily let go of Diep's hand, clumsily smoothing out the hem of her old silk top, a gentle yet timid smile appearing on her lips. James took long, steady strides straight toward the sofa. Not letting Diep's mother feel that cruel sense of alienation for another second, he cupped both of his large, warm hands over her thin, calloused ones. His eyes carried only warmth and profound respect. "Mom," James's deep, steady voice rang out. Every word was uttered clearly and carried immense weight, anchoring their swaying souls. "Today, no one out there has the right to make you bow your head. You gave birth to the most amazing woman in the world for me. You are my most honored guest today and forever." His sincerity made her hunched back, straighten slightly. He shifted his gaze to the younger sister hiding nearby, giving a small, reassuring nod, a smile of family solidarity that snuffed out the panic in the girl's eyes. Then James turned to look at Diep. He stepped closer, reached up, and gently used his thumb to wipe away the fragile tear threatening to spill from her reddened eyes. "Is everything ready, my queen?" James whispered. Diep closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The absolute solidity of this man pumped pride into her chest. All her insecurities were crushed. She opened her eyes and turned to take her mother and sister's hands. "Let's go." The grand hall was bathed in the soft golden light of baccarat crystal chandeliers hanging from the soaring ceiling. The space was hushed. There was only the scent of white roses blending with the somber, melodic notes of a violin from the corner. Hundreds of elite guests, powerful tycoons, formidable corporate partners, aristocratic wives, sat along 2 rows of dark red velvet chairs. As soon as the mahogany doors swung open, James and Diep, along with her mother and sister, walked in. The violin playing the celebratory prelude suddenly quieted down. Hundreds of eyes simultaneously darted toward the entrance. These were not looks of admiration. They were ruthless scanning radars hidden beneath a veneer of fake elegance. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses mingled with sarcastic, scrutinizing whispers, intentionally muffled in their throats, yet still potent enough to snake through the air. They stared at the mother-in-law in her cheap silk top, looked at the bride wearing no precious jewelry, and measured every step of the so-called outsiders invading their territory. Diep's mother walked behind, her bony shoulders unconsciously shrinking. Her steps faltered, hesitant and terrified by the contemptuous, silk-wrapped gazes pointing at her like invisible spears. Feeling the freezing aura from the crowd, Diep also hesitated slightly. Her chest tightened. Her breath hitched. Immediately, James took action. He pulled his arm in tight, pressing Diep's trembling hand firmly against his rock-hard side, a grip carrying the weight of a vow. The aura from this man suddenly exploded, engulfing the space. James's icy eyes darkened. He tilted his chin up slightly, sweeping his gaze across the 2 rows of seats. It was a look laced with naked, lethal intent. Any mocking smile, any scrutinizing or disparaging glance that accidentally met those razor-sharp eyes was instantly frozen. The smirks died out. The sneers were hastily withdrawn. The massive hall suddenly fell into absolute silence. The whispers were crushed beneath the heel of true power. Guided by his steady lead, Diep kept walking. Her head was held high. The fear was completely left behind. The silk swept across the carpet, creating a proud, rustling sound, keeping time with every step. They approached the center floral arch made of tens of thousands of roses. In the front row on the right, Chairman Juan sat there. His hands were clasped together. His face was as still as a statue. He saw the poor mother-in-law's timidity. He saw Diep's resilience. And above all, he saw his son's absolute protection of her. He quietly lowered his chin a fraction. A silent nod. Incredibly subtle, unpretentious, yet carrying the massive weight of total concession. He had cast aside his arrogant ego, officially accepting her existence in this family. A father's silent blessing. The officiant cleared his throat, lifting the microphone to read the sacred vows. The candles on the altar flickered, illuminating the space. Diep turned to look at James. The soft golden light cast a glow on his chiseled face, where those deep eyes held only her image. Every storm seemed to have truly retreated, but in that most sacred moment, just as the officiant's lips parted, a brutal noise tore through the flawless facade of the hall. "Let me go. Where's Diep?" A sloppy, hoarse, and entirely out of place scream echoed from the cracked open main doors. A noisy scuffle. Dozens of guests in the back rows flinched and turned their heads, frowning in annoyance at the vulgarity shattering their perfect world. The event's security rushed to pin a scrawny, hollow-cheeked man down onto the edge of the carpet. He thrashed about like a mad beast. He reeked of cheap, aged liquor. His dirty, wrinkled shirt was a mess. His bloodshot eyes darted around the overwhelming luxury of the hall before locking a fiery, envious glare on the altar. Diep's heart stopped. Her whole body turned as cold as if she had just been drenched in ice water. The blood in her veins seemed to freeze solid, unable to circulate. Despite the distance, despite her vision blurring from the candlelight, the sheer terror struck down her nervous system in a split second. That ghost. It was her ex-husband, the man who had rained brutal, near-fatal beatings down on her head during his mindless, drunken rages. The man who had pushed her to the very bottom of abuse and humiliation. Pinned with his arms twisted behind his back by 2 bodyguards, the baseness, envy, and greed of a bottom feeder pushed him to scream maniacally. He weaponized her absolute worst pains, her ugliest scars, ignoring the mockery of thousands of powerful people around them. "You think wrapping yourself in all this silk covers up your mud stench, Diep?" Hung strained his neck and roared, spit flying, his eyes laced with savage, bloodshot veins. "Take a good look, everyone. That billionaire's wife over there is the woman my family kicked out to the streets for being barren. Back in the day, I beat the living hell out of her. Now you're dragging some bastard baby in here to trap a rich guy into claiming it, you bitch." Those filthy smears, those darkest and most cruel pains were ruthlessly stripped bare and hurled right into the middle of the pure sanctuary. A bodyguard decisively slapped a hand over the man's foul mouth, roughly dragging him out into the dark hallway. The main doors were immediately slammed shut with a dry bang. It all happened in less than a minute, but that 1 minute was a bomb dropped straight into Diep's already scarred mind. The solemn silence of the hall was shredded to pieces. Whispers erupted like an angry swarm of bees. Champagne glasses were slammed down onto glass tables. The gazes carrying disgust, morbid curiosity, and vicious judgment were now all pointing straight at her. A daughter-in-law kicked out for being barren, a cheap abuse victim, a bastard child. Naked mockery closed in from all sides. Diep's mother, standing behind her, was so terrified her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the velvet carpet. She buried her wrinkled face in her hands, sobbing loudly in utter helplessness. Diep stood rooted to the altar. The world around her began to spin. Her physical balance vanished. The noise of thousands of mouths whispering and dissecting her past rang out like tens of thousands of shrieking cicadas. That sound was magnified by her psychological panic, piercing her eardrums like sharp blades. The ghosts of the flesh-tearing beatings, the cold, rainy night she was shunned from her husband's home, empty-handed, and now the absolute contemptuous stares in this place. All her worst memories simultaneously resurrected, swirling into an invisible noose, tightening around her throat. Diep's breathing became ragged. Cold sweat drenched her back, gluing the silk to her skin. The massive psychological pressure, the crushing humiliation, and the extreme shock completely struck down the fragile endurance of a pregnant woman who had just been through days of physical exhaustion. "Diep!" James's voice rang out. He quickly stepped in front of her, using his broad back to shield her from thousands of cruel, probing eyes. His hands gripped her shoulders firmly, squeezing gently. "Cover your ears. Look at me, Diep. Open your eyes and look at me." But Diep could no longer hear his voice. Her eyes were glazed over. The crystal chandeliers on the ceiling began to blur, shattering into blinding streaks of light, spinning crazily. The 1,000-pound boulder of humiliation and pain crushed her consciousness. Gravity suddenly vanished from her legs. Darkness descended. Her legs turned to jelly and she collapsed onto the marble floor. "Diep!" James roared, launching himself forward. On pure instinct, he slipped his arms under her waist and neck, catching her body right before her head hit the cold marble steps. His arms locked around her. Her body was completely limp, as pale as a blank sheet of paper, her chest barely rising, entirely unconscious in his arms. The silk dress lost its folds, trailing across the vibrant red carpet in a heartbreaking, tragic display. The entire massive convention center went dead silent. The air congealed. Diep's mother screamed in panic, crawling toward her daughter, tears streaming down her face. In the front row, Chairman Hoan furrowed his brow and slammed his rosewood cane hard against the floor. The sharp metallic clack echoed through the deathly space, extinguishing any remaining whispers. James no longer cared about any prejudice, any stares, or any judgments around him. Sweeping Diep's ice-cold body up into his arms, he held her tight to his chest, his eyes bloodshot and laced with red veins. He whipped around, roaring, "Get the car ready! Call an ambulance right now!" Holding his woman tightly, he took long, desperate strides straight out of the massive mahogany doors. He left behind thousands of stunned faces, left behind the avalanche roses that hadn't even had time to bloom, left behind an astronomically expensive wedding that had completely collapsed in the blink of an eye. The ambulance siren tore through the city's thick, quiet night. The deafening, urgent, wailing sound was like a frantic race against the grim reaper. Inside the cramped, suffocating ambulance cabin, the stark, cold fluorescent light shone straight down on Diep's pale face. James slumped on the edge of the stretcher. His suit jacket had been stripped off and thrown into a corner of the floor. His perfect hair was now a mess, plastered to his forehead with sweat. He used both of his large hands to completely envelop Diep's growing colder hand. The hand wearing the white silk glove was now lifeless, hanging off the edge of the stretcher. He pressed the back of her freezing hand tightly against his lips, his eyes squeezed shut. Beep, beep, beep. The electronic heart monitor beeped rapidly. The rhythm on the screen flashed chaotic, dry blue streaks. No one said a word. The tense silence of the medical staff at this moment felt like a giant suspended death sentence, an invisible guillotine hanging right above their heads. James rested his forehead against the edge of the cold metal stretcher. The hand that had firmly intertwined with hers under the oak dome of the church the other day, the hand that had once shielded and protected her from countless storms, was now trembling uncontrollably. He gripped Diep's bony fingers tight, as if clinging to his very last lifeline. His lips moved continuously. In this space, he could only grit his teeth, swallowing his bitter, helpless tears deep into his chest. He repeated his fractured prayers over and over, reverently sending them to God. That man was bowing his head, begging him, pleading with him at all costs not to extinguish this breath that was as fragile as smoke. Outside the frosted windows of the vehicle, the sallow streetlights flashed past in a blur. The ambulance siren kept wailing, slashing through the night, barreling straight ahead, carrying a precarious life and bottomless despair, rushing into the endless darkness. That ambulance siren is probably the most haunting and desperate sound. A James who was always so powerful, now totally helpless, shedding tears and praying. The flawless white silk was ultimately stained by the cruelty of public gossip and the ghost of abuse. How do you guys feel about the unbearable psychological shock Diep just had to go through? Did anyone else tear up at the scene where James collapsed by the stretcher? Share your feelings right down in the comments so we can comfort each other. Will that fragile little life survive this deadly storm? And one thing is for sure, James's most ruthless wrath reserved for that ex-husband is now truly about to begin. The answer will be in the next episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the life or death moments in the upcoming episode. Thank you guys so much for always sticking around and listening. Bye for now, and see you next time. Would you like me to help outline the revenge arc or the hospital awakening scene for the next episode?